The Russians, because they've continued to take incredibly heavy losses, for most of the beginning of this year, even though the Ukrainians were very short on ammunition, the Russians were only really able to push that strategy of just pressure with these relatively small-scale infantry and artillery attacks, in terms of small-scale infantry units with lots of artillery, all across the line. They didn't really have the capacity to do like a big, concentrated push. That may have changed.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Justin Bronk, Senior Research Fellow for Air Power and Technology in the Military Sciences team at the Royal United Services Institute. Justin, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thanks for having me.
To begin with, what's your assessment of the Russian offensive in the northeast of Ukraine, particularly in Kharkiv Oblast? Are we seeing signs now that it has slowed?
Certainly, the rate at which Russia was managing to occupy new bits of territory near the border has slowed down. Although it's worth noting that Ukraine never pushed troops right up to the border because obviously then they'd be at huge risk from Russians just on the other side. So Russia was essentially pushing into almost kind of no man's land areas. I think what we're seeing is definitely that they're not pushing any further, and Ukraine has managed to regain tentative control over some of those areas. But that unfortunately the Russian action is, broadly speaking, achieving its objective, which is to further spread Ukraine's pretty thin available manpower and resource and ammunition across an ever wider front line. Because one of the huge benefits that Ukraine gained, as well as, of course, liberating lots of occupied territory when they took back most of Kharkiv Oblast in late 2022, was that it shortened the front lines. So it enabled them to generate better force ratios in the rest of the roughly 1,000 kilometers of front. So Russia has pursued a strategy over the last couple of months of maintaining consistent pressure at multiple different points all along the front line in order to, without expending huge resource in any one kind of major push, just exploit the fact that it has far more manpower in Ukraine to draw on in terms of trained and available personnel, and has a significant still and had a very significant ammunition advantage. So yeah, it suits them to try and wear down Ukrainian capacity by keeping up the pressure in as many different points as they can. So yeah, in that sense, unfortunately, I think Kharkiv is achieving its objective for the Russians at the moment. Although it has proven very costly for them. They've taken very significant losses and continue to do so.
Does that mean the logical extension, the logical next step, is that we may see Russia moving into Sumy Oblast, for instance?
I think it's more the question of exactly where is not necessarily one that I would think has an immediately obvious answer. I think the greater issue is that the next step that we would expect to see from the Russians is a more concentrated, large-scale summer offensive. So one of the points of disagreement between, depending on essentially whose information and whose sources you look at, is how much of a reserve force the Russians have managed to build up over the past 6 months, where the Ukrainians have been very short of ammunition because of that cessation of US deliveries for so long, which has lowered Russian casualties compared to what they were, although they're still very high. And that's enabled the Russians to re-establish training regiments around the borders of Ukraine so they can train a higher proportion of the roughly 130,000 conscripts that they can mobilize every 6 months, which they've always been able to do, and that's been a sort of consistent factor. But for most of the war, they weren't able to actually train the majority of those 130,000 every 6 months. The question now is how much Russia has been able to build up essentially new offensive units and equip them and train them to a decent-ish standards, while maintaining that pressure with those huge casualty rates that they've been suffering all along the front. Some people think the Russians don't have a huge amount of spare capacity. Others would assess that they have significant new groupings of forces that are, broadly speaking, likely to be available for a concentrated push somewhere. And what we've seen consistently is that Russia does tend to plan on at least a major summer offensive. So what we've seen kind of at the moment is the sort of softening up phase, trying to diminish Ukrainian capacity as far as possible before doing a big major push. And that would, at least if you were following Russian military doctrine, which they often haven't for particularly early on in the war, but that would tend to be at a narrow point in the front where they can achieve maximum concentration of firepower and resource. So the key question there will be whether Ukraine can have its ammunition and also crucially its stocks of trained people. They're not running out of people; they're running out of trained people. Because that mobilization decision was in terms of mobilizing more younger people and increasing the training volumes has been slow, particularly because they didn't have any guarantee that they would get additional supplies from the US for so long, and there wasn't much sense, or there was the argument there wasn't much sense to mobilize large numbers of additional people if you can't equip the ones you have. So Ukraine is trying to catch up with that training and mobilization backlog, if you like. The question is, can the influx of new ammunition and that training effort shore up the gaps enough to hold back that Russian offensive push when it comes?
Have Russia almost made a mistake by not making a concentrated offensive earlier, given by the summer Ukraine may well have felt the benefits of the renewed US military aid?
I think the Russians were pushing as hard as they could at the time. One of the consistent problems for both sides, is that they have both taken such heavy losses in sort of established pre-war formations that had the longer term training and the officer, sort of mid-rank officer sort of cadres to conduct large-scale brigade or division-scale operations. Both sides have very much very much lost that capacity, and so what you're seeing is that both sides are operating essentially mostly in augmented company scale groups, which is a couple of hundred men, and that's partly why you've seen such kind of incremental positional attritional warfare. So again, going back to the question of have the Russians managed to build up a sufficient reserve of new units, and have they managed to get the breathing space to train units that can fight at a larger scale? Because that's what you need to do a big kind of concentrated offensive to try and essentially break through the lines and then maneuver to expand and exploit that, as the Ukrainians did in Kharkiv in autumn 2022. So the Russians, because they've continued to take incredibly heavy losses, for most of the beginning of this year, even though the Ukrainians were very short on ammunition, the Russians were only really able to push that strategy of just pressure with these relatively small-scale infantry and artillery attacks, in terms of small-scale infantry units with lots of artillery, all across the line. They didn't really have the capacity to do like a big, concentrated push. That may have changed.
I want to come on to the situation with Ukraine's air defences in a moment, Justin, but just on what we may see from the Russians in the coming months, if they were going to launch a new concentrated offensive somewhere, where do you think they would be targeting? Where are the likely areas they will target?
I mean, the immediate Russian objective is likely to be to complete the conquest of Donetsk and Luhansk, which would mean pushing towards Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. And one of the reasons the Ukrainians are fighting so hard to try and keep Chasiv Yar is that, first of all, it's a very well fortified position. It has high ground. It is a very commanding position. So they don't want to lose it. But also, if it falls, then significant towns and larger towns will come within Russian artillery range, and the Russians have consistently pursued a policy of essentially trying to depopulate the towns that they can. So they just indiscriminately fire artillery into towns to force the population to leave, because that further hurts Ukraine's economy. It creates more internally displaced people. It's obviously demoralizing, and so part of what's driving where the Ukrainians are choosing to try and hold and fight at different points of the front line not only in places like Chazov Yar where they have good ground that they want to try and defend, but also often in places where it's really not optimal to try and fight there. It's because they're trying to avoid the Russians getting into position to be within our regular artillery range of additional towns, which or even small cities. It's the Russian push is likely to at least initially be towards Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And the initial stages would be trying to take key points like Chazov Yar that would unlock parts of that. On the other hand, there is always the danger that the Russians, in a relatively small-scale attack, manage to find a weak point in the line and just push through it and then exploit it. We've seen on both sides throughout the war that sometimes, because of, for example, bad rotation, handover of units, or just misallocation of resources relative to intelligence on where the enemy is planning to conduct attacks, that you get these sort of relatively unexpected breakthroughs, which, if they can be rapidly exploited before the other side has a chance to plug the gap, as it were, to move forces around, then can actually become a much bigger movement in the lines, particularly if key ground lines of communication start being taken, so key railways, key roads. A lot of Ukraine is very arable, forested in some areas, and so in many cases, lots of the country is not easily traversable at speed by armies, and so key road and rail routes are kind of a subtlety which you don't necessarily see on just a territorial map. But if key bits are taken or at least put under fire and observation, then that can really affect the ability to move things around large areas of the front.
Let's come on to the situation with Ukraine's air defences. It's interesting that Germany are once again pushing for more Patriot missile systems to be sent to Ukraine. How badly needed are the Patriots currently? And more broadly, how would you sum up Ukraine's air defences at the moment?
I think it's fair to say the Ukraine's air defences are very overstretched and are really in having a difficult time at the moment. The blunt truth is there just isn't enough ammunition. That is possibly available. It's not necessarily a question of funding or willingness. In a lot of cases, the ammunition required is just it's having to be made, and there's a lot of, particularly for Patriot, there's a huge amount of competing demands for it in an environment where there just isn't enough production capacity to meet that demand. So, for example, you have countries with huge spending power, such as Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, which are routinely attacked with ballistic missiles from Yemen, and so into their cities. So these are countries that are not just trying to build up a stockpile because they kind of want to have a stockpile in case of contingencies. They need Patriot, and they have the money to spend on it. Equally, there's huge US requirements for Patriot capacity in the Indo-Pacific. China has a massive ballistic and cruise missile arsenal, and the US has to defend key bases, for example in Okinawa, or even further afield, for example in Guam. And so and the same goes for the South Korea needs Patriot ammunition, Japan needs Patriot ammunition, Israel is clearly a key draw as well, and then lots and lots of nations in Europe have given Patriot ammunition and launchers to Ukraine, and are trying to find ways to give more, but also they want to be able to defend themselves as well. It's not. Unfortunately, the air defense ammunition is probably the most critical ammunition shortfall in Ukraine at the moment, and it's not a problem that can be particularly easily fixed. Unfortunately, Ukraine is having to make very difficult allocation decisions on where it puts very scarce, not just batteries, so launchers and radars, but also just where it allocates ammunition. And so you see, for example, just an inability to defend Kharkiv from these large-scale glide bomb attacks, as well as S-300 surface-to-air missiles being used as bombardment tools, because risking those launchers close enough to the borders to have a chance of intercepting these things that are coming in very, very, with very little warning in many cases, is just not something Ukraine can afford to do.
And when you talk about that production shortfall, particularly for the Patriots, I mean, how big is it? I've seen some estimates that the order backlog is up to 2 years. I mean, could it be that severe?
It depends on which country is trying to buy and how much the US perceives them as needing to be prioritized in terms of allocation of production, and to a degree how much they're willing to pay. Ultimately, the companies producing these missiles are businesses. If you are a country that is trying to set up a Patriot capacity, let's say the UK decided that it wanted to buy Patriot in order to bolster its own ground-based air defense capability. You would be waiting a lot more than 2 years for any significant ammunition supplies or batteries, because there is just an enormous global outstripping of demand against supply. A lot of the Western medium-range SAM systems, so things like NASAMS, IRIS-T, which are critical for providing defense against cruise missiles, not ballistic, but cruise missiles, both inside deep in Ukraine for key cities, power stations, but also near the front lines. The issue there is not necessarily the ammunition. It is quite short for IRIS-T, but NASAMS, for example, uses the same AMRAAM, so Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, which is the standard kind of NATO air-to-air missile. So there is ammunition. The issue there is batteries, in the sense that because Western countries have had air superiority for so long themselves in any wars that they've had to fight, even if NATO were to end up in a direct conflict with Russia, the big problem would not be Russian aircraft per se. So we just haven't ever really prioritized building large numbers of SAM systems for kind of battlefield medium range things. So as Ukraine continues to run short of its kind of bread and butter tactical SAM systems, the book, as we would say SA-11, the OSA, the SA-8, we're having to find sources to try and get them ammunition, but we don't make it. These are Russian, ultimately Soviet era, and now Russian-made systems. So there are countries around the world that may still have stocks of these things, but there's a lot of politics involved in whether those can be sourced, and it's a real challenge. Ukraine went into the war with an enormous air defense system, and so replacing that, augmenting that to a serious scale, let alone replacing it with Western equivalent systems, is just going to take a long time. Air defense is a really serious shortfall for the Ukrainians at the moment.
In some better news for Ukraine, Belgium has agreed to deliver 30 US-made F-16 fighter jets. Do we know when they will arrive, and when they do, how much of a difference will the F-16s make, Justin?
So there have been some suggestions from Denmark, for example, that F-16s may be delivered into country in the next month. Certainly the first sort of class of Ukrainian pilots, I believe, are through F-16 conversion training now. The question will be on the ground support capacity. So where do you put the aircraft? F-16 requires long, comparative to the MiG-29 and Sukhoi-27 aircraft that the Ukrainians have been flying up to now. F-16 with a combat load requires long runways, but also crucially runways and taxiways that are very smooth and that are completely clear of gravel, stones, any what we call foreign object debris, FOD, because it's a single-engined aircraft with an intake positioned underneath, right next to the ground, which, because of the shape of it, when the engine is at takeoff power, so high power, it creates a sort of very, very strong, almost Hoover effect. So it will suck up any FOD that's on the ground. And because it's a single engine, if you get engine damage because of ingested stuff on takeoff and an engine failure, there's no second engine, so you'll lose the jet. So That's not a problem if you are most air forces not having to develop a capacity under fire, because you will have, you can do what the US Air Force does, which is to have, lots of, take most of the people on a given base do what's called a FOD walk. So everybody just walks up and down the taxiways and the runways 2 or 3 times a day, looking for any bits of anything and picking them up. And as long as you do that and you have smooth, nicely conditioned surfaces, F-16 is very efficient. It's the reason the landing gear is relatively flimsy, and the aircraft's designed the way it is to minimize weight, so to maximize thrust to weight ratio and agility and all of that. The trade-off is in Ukraine. There's quite a lot of work that will need to be done to the air bases that have up to now been being used for and maintained to the standard required for MiG-29 and Sukhoi 27, which are much more FOD tolerant, are twin-engine designs with much more robust landing gear, designed to operate from pretty rough strips. And it's not that Ukraine can't prepare strips to that, bases to that level. It's that doing so is not only visible, so you'll see that they've filled in the cracks in the runways or the gaps between runway paving slabs and things, but also that it's quite personnel intensive, and Ukraine is desperately short of trained people for all sorts of tasks. So if you don't do it, if you can only afford to do it at a couple of locations, then the Russians will work out where they are very quickly. And at that point, they will probably go all out to hit them on the ground. And even if they don't hit the jets, to hit the ground support equipment, the maintainers. Ukraine has very effectively used a dispersed operating model for most of the war when they've needed to. So moving jets around regularly from different bases and using forward air bases to conduct rapid refueling and rearming and that kind of thing nearer the front line. All of that is much more difficult to do with F-16. And again, it goes back to the severe overstretch already on Ukrainian ground-based air defenses. If you're also then trying to protect F-16s on the ground from pretty concentrated Russian attacks, that's a pretty big challenge. So I suspect that when they are pushed into theatre, it will be relatively small numbers in order to try and minimize those dangers, minimize the challenge, minimize the number of personnel that you're having to move around between bases, minimize the target size for the Russians, and so try and potentially disincentivize, the use of massed strikes for a relatively low payoff. But yeah, and in terms of the combat effectiveness, the Ukrainian pilots are some of them are combat experienced, very combat experienced, but they're combat experienced in very different tactics, with using very, very different aircraft that are designed to work in a very different way. And so there will be a question as to how well the aircraft adapts to Ukrainian tactics, can be adapted to Ukrainian tactics, and to what degree the pilots are able and or willing to use Western-style tactics, and whether those Western-style employment methods for aircraft like the F-16 can be integrated with a Ukrainian military that is still very much ground-focused. And so the Air Force is very much a secondary component within the Ukrainian military, as it is in the Russian military. It is a military that is fundamentally run by land officers. And even in the Ukrainian Air Force, a lot of the senior officers are ground-based air defense officers, because Ukraine had a huge ground-based air defense network and has done for many years, and as has essentially saved it from Russian air power for the war so far. All of which is to say, there's a lot of questions around how effective relatively small numbers of F-16 will be able to be in country. It's not to suggest that the program isn't useful. It's vital to keep the Ukrainian Air Force extant and to give them capacity for at least internal air defense against cruise, help with cruise missiles and intercepting Shaheds and other things. But I think it's important to manage expectations because they're such a symbol, and because it was such a political priority after main battle tanks, but by the Zelensky government and the Ukrainian military and a lot of the kind of Ukrainian supporting media, social media kind of community, should we say, that there's a really overinflated expectation among most people about what these jets can achieve. F-16 is not a wonder weapon. It is a design from the 1970s that NATO air forces would not employ as the main tool in a threat environment like we see in eastern Ukraine, anywhere near the front lines. And the tactics that you would normally in a Western Air Force use to mitigate some of those limitations are large formation tactics, using a huge number of different weapons in each sortie for suppressive and targeting purposes. And while you can train Ukrainian pilots relatively quickly to fly very quickly to fly the F-16, relatively quickly to operate them individually, training pilots to lead large complex formations, to plan and to actually employ and coordinate in the air, let's say 4-ship tactics, that takes years and years. It takes Western Air Forces, a minimum of about 3 years, under ideal circumstances, to get people to the point where they're a good 4-ship leader after they join the frontline squadrons. They're already current on type. And we would also normally draw on things like tankers, aerial refueling tankers, to extend the range to give more tactical freedom. The Ukrainians can't operate tankers because of the long-range air defense bubble, so they will have to be at low level with relatively constrained range because jet engines use a huge amount more fuel at low level, and they'll have to be at low level anywhere near the front lines because of that long ground-based long-range surface-to-air threat. So yeah, it will help to some degree with air and missile defense in depth, and it will give Ukraine some more options for delivering air-to-ground munitions from some degree of standoff, which they've already been doing to a significant extent with kind of adaptations for use of Western weapons like GBU-62, which is a JDAM glide bomb, from their existing aircraft. But it's not going to change the course of the war.
Professor Justin Bronk, always appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today on Frontline.